I want to start by considering the fundamental nature of writing. So where better to start than to quote myself? Writing is a process of translating time into space. So, in other words, there are units of spoken language that we capture somehow, but with these written units. And just as the spoken units proceed in time, the written units are arranged in space. And they can be phoneme or segment size, syllable size, morpheme sized, or whatever. And there are variations in and irregularities and non-one-to-one mappings and so forth and so on. But we can pretty much work out a mapping from the space that elapses in speech to an arrangement in space. So what I'd like us to consider here is then, what are these things, these gaps, these spaces that we leave between words or other spots in writing? What are they doing? What are they? Or these little lines that we find between words in linear B. Or even these smaller spaces that we find between letters of an alphabet, like the Roman alphabet. And we've known for a long time that there is no gap between phonemes, that gap between the letters represents. There is no silence or even any clear boundary between individual phonemes. But what about individual words? It's perhaps a little less intuitive, but there is nothing that occurs between words. And when I say nothing, I don't mean a silence or a gap or any that kind of nothing. I mean nothing. One word goes on to the next. And so what are we mapping? Why are we leaving a space? If we just wanted to have phonemic writing or syllabic writing, we wouldn't do that. But it would be probably harder to read. Now, the easy answer here is that in phonographic writing systems like this, there are limitations to phonography, and so we appeal to some morphographic or morphosyntactic even strategies to give cues to the reader. But I'm going to say not so fast. Let's not leap to that analysis too quickly. And so I'd like us to consider a few questions. First, what is the function of spaces or markers between written linguistic units? What aspects of the spoken language signal are they based on? What are the options out there for indicating linguistic units? What do we know or not know about their relative utility? So when I say linguistic units, I mean there are units in the structure of language that clump smaller units together. So phonemes are clumped into syllables in the phonology, and in the syntax, words are clumped into phrases, and which are clumped into clauses. Now, at the boundaries of at the junctures of these clumps, we have a transition from one unit to another, or in other words, we have an abstract boundary. And these boundaries exist in our language models and presumably in our minds, but they have no actual physical extension. But nevertheless, we know that they're there. To use the words of Nesper and Vogel, in the typically continuous flow of speech, the prosodic constituents of the grammar are signaled by different types of cues, ranging from actual segmental modifications to more subtle phonological changes. So to just quickly give you an example of what is meant by that, in speech, we have allophonic processes that are segmental modifications. So in English, we might aspirate a consonant syllable initially. But if we're using phonemic writing, we don't do that. And so the onset of a syllable looks exactly like the coda of a syllable. And so you have no cues in the absence of spacing as to where that boundary is. Whereas if you had heard the aspiration, you would know. Another example that is one of these more subtle phonological cues is what's known as final lengthening in phonological phrases, where there is a distinction between the sluggers boxed in the crowd and the cops boxed in the crowd. Again, if you're just writing that, you won't see a difference between those two prosodic patterns and the cues to the difference in the structures there. So in speech, we have all kinds of boundary cues. And it is these cues that give us information for the first level of speech processing. And these are the only cues that children have to work with. By the theory called prosodic bootstrapping, this is the only information they initially have about the morphosyntactic structure of their language. So pre-literate awareness, at least of L1 morphosyntax, is filtered through the phonology. So what does that have to do with these boundaries in written language? Well, our literate awareness arises from our pre-literate awareness. And so I would like us to consider that boundaries in written language may originate in and reflect prosodic phonology as much as they do morphosyntax. And indeed, at least historically, punctuation, at least in the West, began as cues to delivery. In other words, to prosody, not logical or syntactic structure. Even now, children are told somewhat erroneously to use a comma when you pause. In other words, that it's sensitive to prosody. And so I think we can see boundary as indicators as attempts to capture non-phonological or non-phonemic, but nonetheless phonological information. And even if these systems have become more entrained in the morphosyntactic analysis of speech, of language, nevertheless, these serve the same function in writing as prosodic cues do in speech. So if we look at the levels of linguistic structure, we have two sort of competing but interdependent hierarchies. We have the phonological hierarchy of structures, and we have the morphosyntactic hierarchy of structures. And the phonological hierarchy is dependent on and informed by the morphosyntax. However, it is only the phonological structures that make it into the real world. The morphosyntax is only manifested through the phonological, and those are therefore the only cues we have to what the morphosyntax actually is. Now I've put in bold at the bottom of these hierarchies the linguistic units that are represented as individual signs in various writing systems. And as you go up the phonological hierarchy, the prosodic hierarchy is everything above syllable. And you have to go all the way up to the intonational phrase before you reliably get pauses at the ends of those phrases. And interestingly, that is where in a language like English, we start supplementing spacing with punctuation, which really underscores that spaces do not represent pauses or silence. So we have boundaries that we're trying to indicate. So in the real world, in the external world, if we have boundaries, they are invisible. They have no size. They exist arguably only in our heads. So it's a similar situation. So how do we know where they are? We've got to do something to mark them, as in this example, that small pole in the middle of the field. So we can put up a marker, say, here is the boundary. It's not the boundary, but we're marking the boundary. We can leave an empty space or a demilitarized zone. We can observe cues to the boundary, as in a change of behavior. You may have a change of language, or in this case, a change of traffic regulations. So in writing, we have the same three options. We can use markers, we can use spaces, or we can use cues. So just to see what the options are for that, looking at markers, dots are very common markers. So in Japanese foreign names, in classical Latin inscriptions, it's very hard to see, but there are dots there. And even in modern Microsoft Word. We can use multiple dots. As in this Amharic example, uses 2 dots between words. Etruscan used 2 dots between words, or sometimes between syllables. Old Persian cuneiform divided words with a wedge, and Linear B, as we've already seen, a small line. Tibetan uses dots, high dots at the top line to divide syllables, and longer lines to divide phrases and clauses. Then there's the whole world of punctuation. And I'm not a specialist in punctuation, don't claim to be, but I've just included some examples here of punctuation in various writing systems. And then there are also markers for larger sections of text. And what's interesting compared to the marks we've seen already is that these marks are of different kinds of shape. They're larger and more complex in their shapes, including the oldest piece of written Western punctuation, the ivy leaf or hedera. And interestingly, now that we have a different shape to our punctuation, we're also no longer in the realm of prosody, suggesting that the other punctuation marks are in the realm of prosody. So we've had markers, now we have spaces. We're quite used to that if we speak European languages. But spacing doesn't have to be on this word or phrase level. There's causal spacing and tie. So in this example, you have to get all the way into the second line before you find a space. In Korean Hangul, there are spaces between syllables, but also between larger clumps. Now, in this case, it's typical to call it word spacing. But in fact, if you look at the prosodic hierarchy that I showed you a minute ago, this is composite group spacing. So we have the word here and an associated clitic, case marker, particle here. So what is often called space marking, word spacing, may in fact not be words. In this case, it's composite groups, and I think there's probably a lot of that cross-linguistically. Another use of spaces is in Nastaliq, as used for Urdu. Here, in this case, each word progresses diagonally downward, and then you reset that with the next word. So there is space used here, but it's going in a different direction than the direction of writing itself. Now, cues. There's a lot of cues we use to indicate boundaries, but they're often, in modern writing systems, subsidiary to other uses, like capitalization, which occurs sentence initially, or sometimes word initially, but you know you're at the left edge of a boundary when you see capitalization. Positional allography. An example is the Greek sigma, which has one shape at the end of a word and another shape elsewhere. So even though this is redundant in the presence of spacing, that is a cue to the end of a word. Returning to a baseline in a connected text can show you the difference between one sign and the next. Determinatives can be word boundary cues. So in Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example, this determinative of the seated god not only tells you that the previous word is the name of a god, but also that you've come to the end of that word. A change of script is in Japanese. In this example, we have 4 scripts and Arabic numerals, and the change of script correlates with change of morphemes. There's some fascinating written cues in Divehi, as written in Tana, but I don't have really time to go into this in any depth. But just quickly, if you write some of your allophony, then you've incorporated some cues to boundaries. I do want to mention, however, this unique case of what I'm calling here a punctuation morpheme. In Divehi, all written sentences that are not direct quotes end in a particular morpheme, eve, that does not occur in spoken Divehi. And so even if you did not have that period or full stop at the end of the sentence, the presence of that morpheme will alert you to the end of the sentence. So segmentation of the kinds we've just seen has been proposed as a typological criterion for writing systems. But I hope the little whirlwind tour I just took you on demonstrates that scripts are not just segmented or not segmented, and their boundaries are not just indicated or not indicated. There's in fact a typological richness here that I encourage us to explore further. Now, those of us coming from European languages are quite used to spacing. And we can stop to consider then, is this a good thing? Possibly. Spaces are correlated with the rise of silent reading in Europe. They're correlated with the acceptance of Hangul in Korea. English is read up to 50% faster with word spacing. And word spacing benefits speed and accuracy for readers of Thai, even though they don't normally use it. On the other hand, adding space between words is unhelpful in Chinese, and intercharacter spacing has been shown not to be helpful for Arabic. So there's nuance here, and we need to be careful about what kinds of conclusions we draw from and apply from one writing system to another. Another question, we've seen various kinds of boundary indicators. So the question is, are spaces better than other systems? Well, there's some evidence that suggests they may be. English text with spaces is easier to read than text with some irrelevant character and non-character symbol added. So this sentence is hard to read. However, these experiments have not used the typical shapes and sizes that we've just seen, that boundaries take in actual systems, or that other kinds of actual real-world indicators. So if we use those kinds of markers, I would claim that this sentence is not particularly hard to read, or that there are other cues that we could use, such as capitalizing the first letter of each word, that are also easy to use. So again, we need to be careful about what kinds of conclusions we're drawing and how widely we're applying them. So a final question is, are we getting spacing right? Because where you put it might differ in its ideal application from one language to another. So intersyllable spacing may be better than interword spacing, for example, for Hmong Dao. Phrase spacing has been shown to be helpful for reading English, but we don't use it. There's also research on the optimal spacing widths, so that word spacing at 3.5 times intercharacter spacing has been shown, at least for English, to be ideal for reading. But there's a lot more work there that needs to be done for various scripts and a lot of implementation in font design. And finally, this is not just all about spacing. There were all of those other markers and cues. So how does the ideal indicator for a given writing system vary with script type or the sign shapes you find in a given script? So I feel like I've raised more questions than I've answered. However, I would like to leave you with a few conclusions nonetheless. And one is that boundary indication in writing may be more responsive to prosodic phonology than we tend to believe. And in fact, even where it may not be a direct representation of prosodic phonology, it is directly analogous to prosodic phonology in being the physical cue to the morphosyntax. Writing systems have many kinds of ways to indicate boundaries, markers, spaces, and cues. Writing systems indicate many kinds of boundaries, and what those are linguistically have not always been well described. And this is just one more reason why the relations between spoken and written language are complex and multi-layered, and why we're here, therefore. And finally, I would claim that boundary indication should be part of our research in typological design, script adoption research, as well as writing systems typology. Thank you.
Questions? Yes.
I know this from that in the past in English, there has been a convention in writing to do a double space at the beginning of a sentence after the previous sentence. And that is now not taught. I wasn't taught it, but whenever I gave my parents my essays to write, they would always add in the double space. And my teacher would always know that my parents had edited it because of that double space. And so I was wondering like how conventions like that from like government and teaching are like affecting. Like, I don't think that is helpful in any way to, because we already have the space and the period denoting the sentence. So I was just wondering like the relationship between government putting on these like conventions and how helpful they actually are in terms of what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Partly because I think it actually does do some good. Even with the capitalization and the period, sometimes the capital is so wide and large that it sort of overhangs the space and it can be hard to see. But it's the reason we don't do it. It was a property of the typewriter age. And if you do leave those extra spaces, a page of text is prone to what's known as rivering, which is that you can see a gap in the text that sort of meanders back and forth across the page from one sentence to the next. And it was considered ugly. I don't think there's any actual research into readability that went behind that change. And if I ruled the world, I'd probably suggest that we leave like 1.5 spaces or something, just a little bit more to leave that space. But it's a great example of how readability and legibility research has not driven these decisions.
And I would like to continue what Amalia said about the double space is that for me, it's to disambiguate with the abbreviation point.
Right.
And this is purely syntactic because the double space will be at the end of the sentence, while the abbreviation point will be in the same noun phrase.
Right.
So this is one of the reasons, I believe, from the typographical point of view of the distinguishing double space and single space after the period.
Yeah, yeah, and with modern type design, we should be able to get to first discover and then implement ideal sentence spacing, but we haven't done it yet.
Well, Take is doing it ever since the 70s, putting the double space after the full period. Any question? Yes.
This is not a question, but I would like to, first of all, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. And I would like to, draw your attention to a paper by our colleague, Sven Motterham, published this year, a diachronic perspective on segmentation cues in written Japanese. This is a, great paper, and I guess you can find a lot of interesting things related to the historical way in which Japanese used to segment text.
I'd like to see that. Yes, thank you.